So, where can gold go? Where where it will ultimately go will be the inverse, obviously, of the dollar itself. So just based on the 34 trillion, and assuming that there is truly 8,300 tons of gold, which again has not been audited since, I believe, 1956, you come up with a number of $125,000 an ounce. I think it's important that people understand the measurement of the metals. That's how you go to zero, because all fiat currencies ultimately go to zero because they're not backed by anything. How high is gold going to go? How high is silver going to go? And my constant answer is anybody who gives you a price is making it up, because we really don't have the numerator or the denominator to do the math on that. When I say numerator and denominator, we don't know what the money supply ultimately is going to be. We don't know what the total debt is going to be. And we're told that the U.S. has 8,300 tons of gold, but it's not been audited since 1956. So if you don't know how much money and how much debt is outstanding versus you don't know how much gold the U.S. actually has, then how can you do a calculation on the gold price? Now, as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned, I guess it was about 2 years ago, they came out and they said, we will accept other currencies than dollars. And when I first saw that, I'm like, okay, this is it. It's game on. The reason being, in the past, they would only accept dollars. Now they're accepting other foreign currencies. And then last year, late in the year, the United Arab Emirates came out and they said, we will accept many currencies for oil, but we will not accept dollars. And that is, that's huge. That is, can you imagine that? Even 5 years ago, I couldn't imagine it. Can you imagine it 10 or 20 or 30 years ago? What that says to me is that these producers are no longer viewing the U.S. military with fear. They believe, they can side with Russia, they can side with China, and they've got protection. It's go back to grade school with bullies. Basically, they feel secure enough to tell the bully no. And it's the beginning of not the beginning, but we're well into it, the unraveling of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. And once the dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency, the living standard, not just in the U.S., but the West altogether, is going to absolutely collapse. I mean, think about these central banks that hold 50, 60, 70% or even more of their reserves in dollars. That's going to become a smoking black hole of default, if you will. Their balance sheets are going to implode. The baddest man in town, you switch alliances, allegiances, and that's what they've done. As far as back in 1980, actually in 1980, what happened was gold went to 850, and what it did was it balanced the books, not versus money supply, but versus the U.S. debt outstanding. So, and as you know, Jim did that calculation back in the early 70s, and that's what the allure was for him to do what he did, leading up to 1980. And when we got to, to his credit, when we got to the 850, 875 an ounce, he basically sold everything out because the books, according to his math, were balanced. And I mean, if you did that calculation now based on the debt outstanding, you're over 125,000 an ounce, and that's just the on-books debt. That does not include loan guarantees, et cetera, meaning it doesn't include Fannie Mae, Ginnie Mae, it doesn't include Medicare, Medicaid, it doesn't include any of the other guarantees that the government has put forth. So just based on the 34 trillion, and assuming that there is truly 8,300 tons of gold, which again has not been audited since I believe 1956, you come up with a number of $125,000 an ounce. So, where can gold go? Where gold where it will ultimately go will be the inverse, obviously, of the dollar itself. And the dollar itself, when all is said and done, will go to zero, which will make not just an ounce of gold or an ounce of silver, but a cup of coffee or a Big Mac or whatever. It will make it unattainable. It got to the point where gold, silver, services, any type of goods were no longer offered for the currency. And that's why they had to abandon the currency and come up with a Rentenmark, which, there's further history on that, but that's going way out in the weeds. The Bible talks about honest weights and measures. And you can weigh and you can measure gold. You can weigh and measure silver. Those are real monies. And we got to a point where we've become backwards, where gold and silver are measured by the media, by Wall Street. They're measured in dollars. They're measured in euros. They're measured in yen. And that's really the reverse of what it should be. The reality is an ounce of gold 100 years ago is still that same ounce of gold today. It hasn't changed. It hasn't grown. It hasn't shrunk. What has changed are the currencies that are issued by different governments. And as I said, it's backwards that gold and silver are measured by the currencies, when in fact, the reality is the currencies are measured by the metal. And I mean, when you see gold, like yesterday, for example, gold was up, 30 some odd dollars. Gold wasn't up, it was the dollar that was down. I think it's important that people understand the measurement of the metals. The dollar itself originally was a derivative of gold and silver. The definition of a dollar, I think, is 371 and a quarter grains of silver. That is the definition of a dollar. For 150 years, you could go into a bank with a dollar, with $20.67, and you could exchange that for an ounce of gold. Or conversely, you could go in with an ounce of gold and walk out of the bank with $20.67. Then they called the gold in 1933, and 6 months later, they revalued gold to $35 an ounce. That did two things. Obviously, it took gold away from the population because it became illegal to own, but it also allowed it gave the Treasury itself room to expand their balance sheet because their main asset, gold, expanded from $20.67 to $35. So they devalued by 70%, and what that did was it aided the Treasury, it aided the U.S. government in reflating a system that had a deflation problem, taking us off the gold standard, because the Gaul kept presenting $35, saying, give me 1 ounce. They were sending millions of dollars back to the U.S. and saying, we want gold for it. So that was the reason that Nixon was forced to take us off the gold standard, because our reserves, which at one point were 20,000 tons, and they had dwindled down to 8,300 tons. So that's when they shut the window, and that was August 15th, 1971.